Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber ask a question in a video where I was talking about 5x5 programs, and he says, hey, can you recommend something that focuses more on hypertrophy than strength? And I'm going to point out the problem with that. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Alright, people need to understand that to some extent, you cannot fully separate hypertrophy from strength. Like muscle growth from how strong you get, there is a direct relationship between these two. And when you start looking at more advanced programs, like you see different studies where certain programs for more advanced lifters, they gain slightly more strength or slightly more hypertrophy on one training style versus another. In other cases, they gain the same hypertrophy, but they gain more strength in a different one. The downside being you burn out easier, spend more time in the gym on the strength one. And that's because usually when tonnage is equal, hypertrophy tends to be the same. And that's what people need to grasp when you're comparing different programs and rep ranges and things. Your tonnage usually determines the amount of muscle growth that's stimulated. Such as a study I linked a while back with Dr. Brad Schoenfeld had done, to where they took somewhat experienced lifters already, and they had one group do 3 sets of 10 on their basic exercises, and the other group do 7 sets of 3. So 21 reps worth of triples versus 30 reps worth of 10 reps. All right, and they had equal tonnage because he chose basically numbers by 7 by 3 with rough percentages that he knew roughly how much weight they would lift to their maxes, that they moved the same amount of total weight on those exercises. Well, they gained the same amount of muscle mass over the course of the study, both groups. The 3-rep group got a little stronger. He also noted they were more subject to burnout, things like that. So you need to understand you can't separate these two for drug-free lifters. And I'm going to get to the thing with novices in a minute, but the same thing when studies have been done, and I've linked all this stuff in the past. I don't have time to look each study up again, but I've covered these in other videos, and people can do channel searches to find these videos. When we studied anabolics versus lifetime drug-free people versus people who had used anabolics at least moderate amounts, and they tracked the different drugs they used for the people in the study of what they had used, they found that per unit of muscle growth, the people who had used anabolics weren't quite as strong. Meaning, usually someone who's pretty weak and they're still big, it's probably because they use large amounts of drugs to facilitate their growth. People who use lower amounts of drugs and generally train harder are usually stronger per given unit of muscle mass on their body, per pound of muscle on their body, than people who use the drugs to get there. And that is one thing you'll notice. There are plenty of guys who are massively strong who use a lot of drugs. And I don't mean just strength athletes, but even people in the bodybuilding world. But by comparison, they're still not always as strong pound for pound as some of the guys out there who are completely drug-free and train for strength. That's what creates the confusion. The drugs really create the confusion, because for naturals, you can't fully separate these two things, meaning you're going to see for yourself a very, very strong and most direct correlation between the size and strength you gain. The other reason this gets confusing is there are people who are extremely strong for their size. But people need to understand that person still gained muscle. It's that due to different people's leverages, limb lengths, muscle insertion points, muscle fiber distribution, even the angles of their muscle fibers, some people can generate more force than another person in the same muscle on the same limb, with it being a smaller muscle than the other person. But that person still gained strength in proportion to their size gain. They just didn't have to gain as much size to get a given amount of strength, but they still had to gain size. Now, where this gets even more interesting when we go over and we look at novice lifters, and that's what a lot of these 5x5 programs out there for people in their first year or two of lifting. That's usually where this is pushed. 5x5s, sets across, actually become very difficult to do with any volume for more advanced lifters. They're actually very difficult to recover from. You don't see it pushed as much, and there's this confusion out there that rep and set schemes like that are made for strength instead of size. And that's absurd, because the whole 5x5 system, the sets across type, was originally developed for bodybuilders by bodybuilders. That's not a powerlifting or a strength athlete protocol. It really isn't the way that people think it is. It got confused that way when Bill Starr wrote a peak set 5x5, in which you only have one really heavy set, but still call it 5x5, that he wrote for football players, and even NFL players at the time. Some of them were running it, and it was vastly successful. But that creates confusion. Now, the thing when we come back to novice lifters, you cannot train for one versus the other. You can't differentiate between them because novice lifters have to add weight to the bar to gain strength. If you're in your first 6 to 9 months of lifting, if you're not adding weight to the bar pretty much on a weekly basis, you're not growing. And here's why. Because novice lifters are capable of making what we call linear gains. They don't have to undulate anything. They don't have to mix rep ranges. They don't have to do any sort of periodization. They just grow, 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 grow. And as long as you don't push them to the point of overreaching so that they're actually recovering week to week, you can keep adding weight for novices with an occasional back down, occasional weight reset, and then push them back up again. And the reason that this is important is because what you find otherwise, if you have a novice lifter focused purely on adding volume to gain muscle mass and to progress, what happens really quick? You come in with a novice lifter, they can only bench press 65 pounds for 5 reps, right? And I expect people at the end of my novice program to be hitting as much as 225 pounds for 5 reps. At minimum of 205, hopefully 225 for 5 reps by the end of that 1-year program for people who are fresh in the gym. Do you guys see the problem there with how this is going to work out? So you don't have them focus on getting stronger. And you guys got to remember, rep strength is still strength. If you get stronger as your 10 rep sets, your 1 rep max goes up. You're stronger still. Even though you're working with high reps, you still gain strength. But let's say they could only bench press 65 pounds for 5 reps, right? Well, how are you going to get them bigger without putting weight on the bar? Are you really going to have that person keep bench pressing 65 pounds? Before long, they're doing 6 reps, 7 reps, 12 reps, 15 reps, 20 reps. Well, then if you want to keep them at 65 pounds, before long, you're doing 3 sets of 20, 4 sets of 20, 5 sets of 20. You have a person doing 100 reps with 65 pounds in one workout. Now, does anyone really think that that's the fastest way to gain size? Because plenty of novice lifters get really big and gain their new gains in their first year doing these various programs. A lot of us recommend my program, even people who do starting strength, strong lifts. There are a lot of 5 to 8 rep range programs for novices to where they add weight on the bar every single week and they grow and grow and grow. But the point is, how are you going to differentiate this? How can you honestly not put weight on the bar and think they're going to get stronger? And for more intermediate lifters, that makes sense. You could, in theory, keep adding volume and get bigger. Let's say on their bench press, they're able to do 225 for 5 reps. Well, if you were to push them to where they can do 6, then 7, then 8, then 10, okay, sure, you could not increase weight on the bar and keep adding reps and keep adding sets with a moderate weight like that, like 225, and they can get pretty big. I mean, you get a person who can do 20 reps with 225 instead of 5 reps, they're probably going to be a pretty big, pretty strong dude. But here's the thing. You're still training them for strength. And I think the other confusion that comes in, we're talking about increasing workload using the same range of motion. I'm not talking about, some people will see power lifters who train their bench press and they do a lot to get leverages and increase the weight without getting stronger or without gaining muscle, meaning when you start arching, you take range of motion out. But here's the thing. If you arch and you remove 3 inches from the hardest part of the range of motion, the bottom of the bench press, and you're able to do more weight, did you really get stronger? People are like, well, you moved more weight, but you didn't do more work. You didn't really get stronger. You used technique to make the lift easier to lift more weight. All right, that didn't increase your strength at all. The muscles didn't get stronger. Your nervous system didn't get stronger. You just found a leverage advantage and a technique that allowed you to lift more weight with the same amount of strength. So people need to understand that's not necessarily strength building. The same thing, you go wider and wider on the grip. The exercise can get easier because you're trimming out range of motion, you're changing leverages. So in theory, if you really wanted to do the most work, a closed grip bench press with a fairly flat back without doing a lot of arching, that would move the weight through the longest range of motion. That's the hardest flat bench to do, but it also works the muscles the most. But some people would try to say, well, it's doing the longer range of motion, that's bodybuilding, not strength. Well, no, that's not strength either. In fact, I generally recommend that people do variations like that to do most of their strength building, and then when they get closer to competition time, they start increasing the weight, by using the other technique, going out wider, using more arching, making the exercise easier so that you can move more weight with the strength that you already built. But there's a difference between strength building by training your body and training the muscles versus using technique and leverages and trimming range of motion out on exercises to lift more weight. They're not the same thing. And there is some confusion there because one of those is a powerlifting technique. But the thing is, you need to understand plenty of people use the other variations, the other methods to build their strength. And there are coaches who train people that way, who recommend that for the overall strength building and building your strength base on any athlete at any given time, even for someone who's going to compete in powerlifting. Because it produces a more well-rounded strength. All right, it produces a more well-rounded strength because you're training everything through a longer range of motion. You're doing it the difficult way and progressing on that and getting stronger on that. And then you can use heavier weight when you use the other techniques, but you're not subjecting people to using the heaviest weight possible by using a reduced range of motion or something throughout the rest of the year. It keeps people more injury-free. Because simply put, a narrower grip bench press is easier on your shoulders. Even though it's more difficult for the muscles, your pecs and triceps have to do more work, it's easier on your shoulders. So therefore you can have people do more total work with less chance of injury. And that's better for strength building. But again, this sort of stuff creates confusion and convolutes it. And people really think that you can separate strength training from hypertrophy as if they're two separate things. But the truth is they really aren't. They really aren't. It becomes confused because of different methods people use. It becomes confusing due to different people's genetics, and then drugs can really confuse the whole situation as far as different people's results. But the reality is, particularly for drug-free lifters, and even more importantly novice lifters, you can reach a point where you can't separate strength and hypertrophy training. They are the same thing. Particularly for first-year lifters, you're not going to be able to train for one without focusing completely on both at the same time. They're equally trained with almost everything that you do. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.